Well, hello and welcome to the show, everyone. It's Morag here on Sense Making a Changing World show, and we're continuing our Permaculture Writers series. And my guest today is Pippa Chapman from West Yorkshire in the UK. And Pippa is the author of A Plant Lover's Backyard Food Forest. And I'm really excited to talk with her today about not only her love of plants, because that's something I deeply share with Pippa, but also a love of food forests and a world in permaculture and permaculture writing. So, welcome to the show, Pippa. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me here.
So, maybe we could just begin with a description of your food forest or your forest garden. I tend to call them food forests, but a forest garden and a food forest in my mind is kind of a similar thing. So maybe begin, like, do you see a distinction between that? And then maybe describe a bit about what your forest garden is where you are in your backyard.
Yeah, well, I think that's quite a good place to start actually, because quite often when I'm talking to people about what I do, I say that a food forest is a good description, because quite often forest gardening is a bit of a confusing term. But in terms of what I do, I tend to call it a forest garden because quite often the focus of what I'm doing is not always food. So, I think that's quite an important distinction. I've done some which are sort of more healing medicinal forest gardens. I've just been designing a forest garden at a community garden that we're setting up at Esholt Hall with Yorkshire Water. And as part of that, we've created a teaching forest garden, and each section shaped sort of in a circle, a bit like a mandala garden, and each section has a different focus. So one focus is food, another is medicinal healing plants, another section is all about fibres for weaving and creating textiles and cordage and dyeing plants for doing natural dyeing, and another section is actually focused on habitat and wildlife as well. So yeah, I think food forest is a good term when you're describing it to someone who's new to the term forest gardening, because I think it explains it a lot better. But I tend to think of myself as creating forest gardens because it's not always about food.
I love that distinction because you're right. I mean, it's not all about the food. I mean, if you're thinking from a human perspective and creating edible gardens through a permaculture lens, you tend to put that as the first thing. But as you say, there's so many other benefits of and purposes, as well as the purpose of being a wildlife, a rewilding garden. I wonder whether it's something to do with the fact that, there's Robert Hart and his forest garden, like whether the UK movement has that terminology more in the culture of that gardening, or do you have any
I
thoughts
think
on that?
so. I have noticed over the last few years the term food forest creeping more into the UK. And when I was writing my book, it was, do I call it a forest garden or a food forest? But as I say, in the end, because quite often I'm doing forest gardens that aren't, the sole focus isn't food, I decided to go with forest gardening. But quite often I use the term food forest as well. But it's definitely starting to come into the UK more now.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you for describing that. I really appreciate that distinction. And I do like the image that the term forest garden conjures up. I imagine wandering through this beautiful garden that is a forest in and of itself, rather than, focusing on the food first, but thinking about the forest, the ecosystem as being the main part of it. Yeah, wonderful. So what cultivated in you in the very beginning a love of plants? Because you obviously have a deep relationship with the plant world. Where did that begin for you?
I think I've always enjoyed gardening. I remember when I was younger, my mum used to go out and potter around in the garden, and I would love to go and help. I would take out my little dolls and we'd, play fairies in amongst the flowers, and I just used to really love it. The first bit of garden that I was given as a child, I used to grow lupins and nettles. I think really just because they were the two things that grew well there. I used to always try and give my family nettle soup, which they weren't always very happy about. But yeah, I think I've always liked being outdoors. I used to go out. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, so I used to go out looking at wildflowers and drawing pictures of them, writing poems about them. And so I've always really enjoyed the natural world. But when I was at school, I think because I was naturally very good at drawing and painting and things like that, that was the direction in which I was sort of encouraged to go. And when you're at school, there isn't horticulture or certainly when I was at school, that wasn't an option. There was no option to sort of study plants and gardening. So it just never occurred to me to go into that as a profession. So I ended up sort of going off for a few years, doing a degree in fine art, then really hating being indoors all the time in an art studio. I thought I would really love it, being in this amazing creative space, but I just wanted to be outdoors. And so while I was thinking about what I wanted to do, I got a job in a garden centre. And I was just really lucky that this particular garden centre had all sorts of weird and wonderful, quirky plants. It wasn't like your usual garden centre that's mostly a pet shop. It was a proper plant nursery. And so I really got to know individual plants, and they wouldn't just have sort of one geranium, they would have 50 different types of geraniums. So you really could get to know the slight differences between the different plants. And I think that really set me up well for my plant knowledge, certainly, and all the botanical and Latin names for plants as well. But after a while, I just felt I wanted to actually garden with the plants, not just propagate them and sell them in a garden centre. So I got a job in a large private estate in Yorkshire. It was a beautiful large house with about 5 acres of garden, which was fantastic. And even luckier, after a while, they promoted me to head gardener, which was fantastic. So I got my own cottage on site, and just a beautiful place to live and so much to learn. I had to do everything from rose pruning to gardening in the kitchen garden, and it was fantastic. But once again, I got to a point where I realized that even though I didn't know very much, I was the most qualified person there, and therefore there would never really be the opportunity to learn more, and I have always enjoyed learning, and I just felt I could stay there forever until I retired, but that just wouldn't suit me at all. And I was lucky enough to find that they do, the Royal Horticultural Society do traineeships, and I'd live not far from Harlow Carr, which is their northern garden in Harrogate. So I applied for a place, and it was a bit of an odd move because normally you would apply there as a sort of very beginner rather than coming from head gardener to trainee.
Yes. They were what?
Yeah, so but I think they could see my enthusiasm and how much I wanted to learn more. I was a head gardener, but really I wasn't a very knowledgeable gardener. And so, yeah, they accepted me, and it was a fantastic year. You got to, it's a bit like an apprenticeship, really. So you got to go around each different department. So 1 week I'd be working with alpine plants in the alpine house. The next week I'd be in the woodland. The next week I would be in the kitchen garden, moving around all these different departments all the time and just soaking up so much knowledge. I used to go home and do further research for the evening and put together a massive diary of everything that I learned within that year. And yeah, that was absolutely amazing year of learning. And I think I was lucky that there are, certain elements of the RHS that still have quite old-fashioned approaches to things, but at Harlow Carr they were very into sustainability and the environment. And actually they did have plans when I got there to plant an acre of forest garden, which unfortunately never happened. So it never
I was
got
just going to say,
planted.
how's that going?
I know now it would have been a wonderful example of forest gardening to go and look around, but that never got planted. But it introduced me to the idea of forest gardening.
Oh, okay.
And it was whilst I was there that I was looking around the bookshop, because they have a fantastic bookshop there, and I love reading, so I was having a little look around, and I came across an introduction to permaculture book.
Was it Patrick Whitefield's book?
It was, yeah. And I had never heard of it before. No, it might have been Graham Burnett, actually, or Graham Bell.
Okay.
I can't even. I've still got it somewhere, but it's so long since I've read it now. And that was, as I was reading it, I just thought, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is how, I want to approach my future career in horticulture. And it just made perfect sense. That's what I wanted to do. And so that was sort of the beginning, really, of my permaculture journey.
Which bit about it appealed to you, do you think, like coming from that horticultural plant perspective? What bit drew you to the permaculture ideas?
I think it was the holistic approach to it all, really. I think in my previous job as head gardener, the clients had wanted bowling green lawns. So I'm there trying to plant flowers for pollinators, but at the same time, I'm pouring, weed killer and moss killer all over the lawns. And I remember one day, which was really one of the final straw days that I decided I just can't do this anymore, was watering weed killer over clover, and watering a bee as bee just flew onto a flower just at the moment that I put this weed killer on. And I just felt like, no, I can't do this anymore. There must be another way. And I think it's just that feeling of a lot of gardening is very much how to control nature, how to work against nature. And it just always felt a little bit wrong to me. So when I started reading about permaculture and about this sort of holistic approach of how the garden is part of nature, and actually how to work with that, and how to make the best of a plant, rather than, if you've got clover in your lawn, then actually it's doing loads of great things. And just having a totally different perspective on gardening. Unfortunately, I never managed to convince the clients there to leave their weeds in the lawn. But when we now take on clients and they have weedy lawns, we explain the benefits. And we do have somebody who they do insist on us mowing a very large area of lawn, but they are quite happy for the buttercups and the clover and all the other weeds to just stay in there, which feels like a huge step forward.
That's fantastic, isn't it? And so you have clients, so do you do design work as well as the maintenance work? How does your permaculture or forest gardening career look? What does that look like?
I think from everything that I learned when I was at the garden centre, I was really lucky that the person who owned the garden centre also ran a design and landscape business, and he was hoping, I think, that he would take me on as a garden design apprentice. So I did get a chance to learn quite a bit about garden design. But I did feel very quickly, even before I learned about permaculture, that I didn't like just designing a garden, planting it, and then never seeing it again. It didn't really give me much satisfaction, and I didn't feel that I was learning very much, because how do I know what those designs turn into? How do I know how successful the planting design was? Because I never see it again. So now I would say we manage and develop gardens. So I will take on a garden, and usually it will develop and be redesigned slowly, rather than coming in and saying, oh, I've seen your garden for 5 minutes, here's what I think we should do, get some bulldozers in, and then plant it up, and that's it. So
I really like that approach. Yeah,
I tend to say that we manage and develop gardens. I do some design work, but generally if somebody wants a design, I say, why don't I come and give you a consultation, and then during that consultation we can discuss what your needs are. I can have an assessment of the site, and then usually whilst I'm there I say, I think it would be much better if you developed this garden slowly rather than just got rid of everything and redid it all at once.
So when you say we, is that you have a team?
Oh yeah, my husband Andrew. We actually met while I was at Harlow Carr.
Great.
And so yeah, we both share a love of plants. He's a bit more sciencey than me, so he's got a sort of more botany and plant sciences background than I have. But yeah, it complements it quite well. I come from the more artistic side, and he comes from all the plant sciences. So we have lots of fun.
So great to
chatting.
have a partnership like that, isn't it? Wonderful. I was going to ask you about your artistic side and how you found that you've been able to weave that into your world of permaculture and garden management and maintenance.
I think when I first, particularly when I first started with permaculture and the learning about forest gardening, I felt that I had to leave behind all of my artistic ornamental stuff. You know, I felt like everything had to be functional and edible and useful, and that there wasn't a place for all of the beautiful plants. And I think as my understanding of permaculture grew, and it's just as much about people care and our relationship with the garden, I started to bring more ornamental plants in, and understanding that okay, maybe I don't need a bit of willow woven edging around my bed, but maybe it gives me a lot of joy to make it and see it there, and that's enough actually, because that enhances my relationship with the garden. And the more that I enjoy being in my garden, the more beauty that I see in it, the more that I'm going to actually go out and to garden in it. And actually once I discovered that, I think that is where it was like a kind of light bulb moment where everything really came together. And at that point was when I started to do a lot more forest gardening within some of the gardens that we manage as well, because I could say, you know, well, yes, I can create you a forest garden that will give you food, be low maintenance, and also be really beautiful. And that's what has always sold it to people. You know, before that I was saying, well, we can have a few fruit trees and a few shrubs and some edible plants. And I think for a lot of people, particularly when you have a really small garden, you know, that they're sort of saying, well, what about my beautiful flowers? You know, I want it to look nice. And the same at home really. We had, even though we've recently moved, but where we were before, we had 5 acres altogether that we could garden on. Not that we did very much with most of it, it just sort of rewilded it really. But the area that I used the most was a very small yard with just a few beds. It was mostly paving. And to start with, I had just concentrated on edible plants, and it was very much just green. It was very green. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it did just feel lacking. You know, it wasn't a really beautiful space. And it wasn't until I started to introduce some more ornamental flowers, both for pollinators, but also just plants that weren't, some sort of more tropical plants as well, that pollinators in this country, you know, we don't have hummingbirds, so I couldn't even suggest that they were plants for pollinators. They were just beautiful plants that I love. And that was when I really began to fall in love with our yard as a space to garden in. And on tours, when people would come and look round, that would be the part of the site that they wanted to talk to me about the most. You know, oh, I've got a small garden like this, you know, what's this plant and how can I grow it in my garden? And so that was really the start of what led to the book, really, is just wanting to say to people, you know, yes, forest gardening is about growing useful and edible plants, but don't forget that it can be beautiful as well, and that you don't need an acre or 5 acres in which to grow it. You can have it in a small corner of a small garden.
Yeah. So what does a forest garden look like in your part of the world? Can you describe maybe what are some of the guilds or some of the diversity of different plants that you have in there? I mean, I'm calling to you from like gubby country here in Queensland, in subtropical Queensland. My concept of what a Yorkshire forest garden like is kind of, I have an image of it, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what all the different plants are in it. So I'd love to have a visual walk around. Yeah.
I suppose there's 2 different versions really, because I have a forest garden that we grow that's very wild. So it's really very much like a young British woodland with silver birch and alder and oak. But underneath that, there are gooseberries and roses and raspberries and mint, things like that. So it looks very wild. It still has grasses and docks and primroses and things like that growing within there, and I really love that space, because really all we ever do is trim a path through it and throw the grass around some of the fruit bushes, and that's pretty much it. I think we've occasionally gone in and taken out a tree as a silver birch, which was self-seeded, got bigger and bigger, and there were too many, so we've just occasionally taken a few bits out. But that's really how it looks, really like a young British woodland, but with edible plants in, and so that's a lovely, you know, even bluebells in there as well.
Beautiful.
That's a lovely space. But the gardens that I do that are in smaller spaces, you know, you just can't be that wild. You know, one silver birch would take up the entire garden, so you have to have a completely different approach. So I would say that the forest gardens, the small scale forest gardens that I do, look much more like a garden, and it just happens that the plants in them are also edible and useful. So I have a guild where I have an edible hawthorn, so that's a Crataegus arnoldiana, and I know the wild ones that we have in this country are edible as well. So I would say maybe a culinary one might be a better description, so one with larger, tastier berries. And we've crown lifted that a bit so we can fit some other things underneath. So I use things like Taunton Dean kale. It's one of my favourite kales, so I grow that a lot. Even though it's got really tough, thick leaves, which the pests don't like so much, once you cook it, it's just melt in the mouth and delicious. So I use that quite a lot. And I've put under there as well blackcurrant. So I use blackcurrant quite a lot, and some raspberries. So I don't like to stake my raspberries or put any supports in, but I will grow them in little groups, and I will just tie them at the top with some string like you would a sort of obelisk, and then they support themselves. So I've got some raspberries in there as well. Underneath that, I've got some lemon balm, chives, some good King Henry. I don't know if you know good King Henry. I've got that in there as well. And in amongst that, I've got some flowering plants as well. So I've got things like some salvias, some catmint, some pulmonarias, which are flowering right now, looking lovely. And even bulbs as well. So I love crocus because they come up really early before anything else comes in, and they don't grow so big as to cause any problems to any of the other plants that are coming up.
It's really interesting. So many of the ones that you're mentioning, except for the hawthorn, I have here too in my garden.
Yeah.
You know, like the range is really huge. I mean, obviously they probably grow differently and have, you know, different seasonal changes, but you know, we've got some crocus and the you know, the lemon balm and all of the different things like that you mentioned too.
Yeah, I think in particularly in West Yorkshire and even more specifically the valley that I tend to have most of my gardens in that I manage, it's light levels is what we struggle with. You know, I
was just going to ask you about that, because quite often people when I talk about, these concept of food forests and forest garden, they say, yeah, that's all right where you are because you get so much light. But I'm I'm in such and such a place where, the light levels are really low. So how do you explain that to people and to encourage them to try this way of gardening when they're used to the notion that it needs to be sort of open and flat and catching all the sun? So how do you design it?
I think I tend to just suggest that because I think people think forest gardens and the focus is always the trees and how many trees can I fit in my garden. And actually, by putting in lots of trees in this area, you really do limit what you can grow underneath. So I always try and say, be a bit sparing with the trees, plant them a bit further apart than you want. Don't try and squeeze in as many as you can. Yeah. And then really concentrate on the understory. You can grow so much in the shrub and herbaceous layers. And to try and make that more of a focus. So that tends to be how I garden. So I will really space the trees out quite a bit. And at the end of the day, there's only so many apples that you're going to eat.
Yeah, that's right.
So do you really need 10 apple trees or could you get away with 2? So I think in areas where there are lower light levels or maybe you've got a very shady garden, then really look at, there are a lot of understory plants that will grow quite happily in shade. I mean, I even have a blackcurrant growing under a ginormous Elaeagnus umbellata, and it pretty much gets 1 hour of sunlight in the middle of summer, and it still fruits really well. So, I think don't assume everything has to be in full sun, but equally don't take away all of the sun because you're so keen to get so many trees in.
And what about the management and the maintenance of a garden like this? Have you noticed that it actually simplifies the way that you garden in terms of what about the time and the effort it takes to keep a garden looking good, or is there still do you find lots of management required for how you do it?
I think that growing this way, and we've always, even in our purely ornamental borders, we've always had the same approach, which is put as many plants as you can in. You don't want to see any soil, and there will barely be any maintenance at all. So we just sort of around this time of year, February, March, is when quite a lot of the weeds get going before the plants. So you can get in there and take out anything you really don't want. I mean, in our wilder forest gardens, as I say, we don't do really any maintenance at all. Nobody minds if there's dandelions or docks or grass or anything. But in our smaller scale, more ornamental forest gardens, I will go in this kind of time of year. I will take out any weeds that I think will swamp out other plants. And then we will give a layer of mulch if needed. Quite often on a smaller scale, it's harder to get that self-mulching, self-managing garden. We'll go in, do a weed, do a mulch, and then that's pretty much it for the year, other than going in and harvesting. So occasionally there'll be a plant that's just so happy where it is, it starts to take over the garden. And so I might have to go in and cut it right back and dig bits of it out. Even in the middle of summer, there's a lot of plants where you can go in, you can cut them right to the ground, give them a bit of a mulch and a water, and they will come back and give you another crop. So I would say mainly it's the harvesting as maintenance throughout the year. But really just once a year I go in, do a bit of a weed, take out what I want, do a bit of editing if things need moving around, some things die, even if you've put them in the right place and the right soil and the right level of sun or shade, they'll just die for no reason. So I do quite a bit of editing as well.
I've never heard it called that. I love that, editing. Is that a horticultural term, is it?
I suppose so. It's just what I've always called it. I don't know. So, it's just.
I was going to ask you about the feed. I heard you saying, you'll add a bit of mulch and water, but what about feeding? How do you keep the nutrient levels maintained in a garden like this? Do you find there's enough sort of nutrient cycling going in, or do you add anything else in composts and other things?
I think a lot of that depends on what you're planting and how heavily you're cropping as well. I do try and add as many plants as possible that will add nutrition, so nitrogen fixing plants, and also things like comfreys. So I will
What are the
try and
nitrogen fixing plants in your area that you find
so
helpful?
there's things like clovers and lupins and peas and beans, plants like that, a lot of which are really attractive as well as being edible. So they're really nice additions. If you're growing a lot of annuals in there as well, and I always think, it doesn't have to be purely perennial. A natural woodland doesn't have just perennial plants in, it has annuals and biennials in as well. And so I think it's really good to mix those in there as well. So if you're cropping heavily with a lot of annuals, then you might need to bring in some extra feed. But really, we just bring that in the form of a mulch.
Yeah.
So I don't go around liquid feeding or anything like that. And if there's something that's really struggling and just not looking very happy, I tend to think I'll take it out and replace it with something that will grow better in poor soil rather than
trying to force something to grow.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Often, in gardens we can tend to be really protective and push something along, whereas, maybe, like you're saying, the best thing is to think, oh, maybe this is just not the right plant in this place.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. So tell me more about your book then. So firstly, are you a writer? How did you get to the point of going, I'll write a book about this? Was that I'd love to hear a bit about your process of writing too as well.
Well, I definitely wasn't a writer. I wouldn't have called myself a writer at all. I am terrible at spelling as well, which has always put me off a bit. I think I just really wanted to share my learning. I wanted to share my approach. And I had done a couple of articles for the Permaculture magazine, just really along the same lines. I just had been doing something that I was really enjoying. I wanted to share that. And the Permaculture magazine, Maddie very kindly agreed to put my article in their magazine, which was amazing because, not being a writer, I didn't know that I would ever be able to do that. So that was fantastic. And then I think I just got to the point where I thought, I'm really ready to share my learning now. I want people to see that they can have forest gardens at home, that they don't have to constantly be dreaming of, buying a small holding or an acre of land or moving somewhere, and to just do it now. And so I had a chat with Maddie about it, and they agreed that sounded like a great idea. And I think I was one of the few people who actually lockdown got in the way of writing my book. So it was actually delayed because of lockdown. Because we have a gardening business, we could carry on working. We were able to keep going to work, so no furlough for me. And the kids were off school, so I was homeschooling. They didn't take well at all to the idea of Zoom lessons. They could not sit and concentrate on a screen. It just wasn't happening. So we basically homeschooled for all of the time that they were out of school, which was loads of fun. We did all sorts of interesting environmental learning. That was lots of fun, but I didn't get any writing done at all. And so it wasn't really until things had settled down again and they'd gone back to school that I could get working on it properly. And I think I would really encourage anybody listening to who's already done their permaculture design course to do a diploma in applied permaculture design, because that really was helped me to approach permaculture in a different way, to really understand it on a completely different level. And so when I was doing my diploma, I think I was struggling with some of the design processes and how to use them to design better, because I wasn't just designing gardens, I was designing my livelihood, I was designing how I manage my home and family life. And so I actually did, as one of my designs in my portfolio, I did one called Designing the Design Process. So I kind of unpicked all of the different design processes that are used in permaculture design and came up with one that worked really well for me. And so when I was thinking about writing a book, I did a bit of a survey. So I read some of the books that were my favorite ones on forest gardening. I tried to work out what gaps there were that didn't quite answer the questions that I had. And I also identified the fact that I wasn't a writer. So, that might have been an issue. And also that I had no time in which to write a book. So even after the kids went back to school and work calmed down a bit, I still, work full time, have a busy family life and manage a garden at home as well. So I decided that the only time in which I had to write really was little snippets of time. So most of the book was written in my van while my daughter was at running club. And so that would be it would be just under an hour of time that I would have. And so it's very hard to focus when you just have this small space of time.
Yeah.
So I had to realize quite early on that I had to be very organized about it. So I looked at the idea of pattern to detail. So I broke everything down. I looked at what chapters I wanted to write. So before I wrote anything, I already had all of the chapters, the subheadings and the general topic of each paragraph within those headings before I wrote anything. And it meant that I could very easily drop my daughter off at running club, sit in the van, which was actually great because I had no distractions at all. I just had my laptop and a coffee.
Yep.
And then I could just look through my list and I could think, right, today I'm going to do this paragraph or this chapter.
Tackle piece by piece.
Piece by piece. And then, so when I finally got all those pieces together, I then did take some chunks of time so I could read through them and make sure that they made sense and that they flowed well. But it was a case of really using permaculture design very rigidly to do the survey analysis design and then going through each stage, and that was the only way that I could have made this book happen.
Oh, that's inspirational, because so many people saying, I just simply don't have time. What you just described is amazing.
I think that it's just, once you've decided that that's what you want to do, then you have to just find a way to make it happen, really. I could have easily just sat in the van and listened to a podcast or scrolled on Instagram or something like that. But it was really enjoyable as well, because at the beginning I just thought, well, I don't even know if I'll enjoy writing. I might really hate it. And actually I discovered I really, really love it. I really enjoy it. And so I'm now starting to look at how I can do more writing as part of my poly income. And
as another book or in different ways?
Yes, I'm already working on book number 2 very slowly at the moment, because we've just moved house, so that's got in the way of things a bit. I'm looking at maybe writing for other gardening magazines, and I've just joined in the UK we've got the Garden Media Guild. So that's I've just joined that and having a few chats with people from that, which has been really interesting. So I feel like it's opened up a whole new world of things.
How long did it take you from the moment you kind of started mapping out your chapters until the book came out? Or maybe till you finished your bit and then...
I think probably it was about maybe a year and a half, something like that. But a lot of that time was spent being frustrated that I couldn't write it because of lockdowns and everything. But I think once I really started working on it properly, it was probably about 6 months maybe of writing. But I think because I'd spent so long thinking about it and scribbling the odd little note, when I actually sat down to do the writing part, it came together really quickly. And obviously,
did you organize your note taking and stuff? Did you have like
in a not very organized way, just in a book, randomly writing stuff down? And I would try and write, depending on what the notes were about, I would try and write a big headline so that when I'm flicking through it later, I can see at the top of the page it would say, you know, how to design polycultures and guilds, so that I would know that because I knew what my headings were, I would know that those notes would relate to that. So when it came to writing each chapter, I could gather all my notes together from you know.
And what about illustrations and things? How?
I did take a lot of photographs. So my husband and I both really enjoy photography as well, and because what I've written about is what we do, you know, that's what we work on a daily basis. We had literally thousands of photographs that I had to trawl through. So that actually took possibly almost as long as writing the book, trying to get through all the photographs. And I did, one of the things that I did in lockdown with the kids was doing some lino cut printing. So we really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed it so much that I decided to incorporate some of those into the book as well. So there's a few of my lino cuts in there as well, which was really fun. So I think that was really nice too, that I had all of the photographs to illustrate what I was talking about as well. And it definitely is a book that's full of pictures. You know, there's a lot in there, which is really great, because I think, you know, so often you can write about forest gardening and the theories, but actually to have some pictures is really helpful.
So helpful, really helpful. That's right. And also at a scale that makes sense to, you know, like that backyard context that you're talking about. It's fantastic. So I wonder too if you could just talk a little bit about the publishing process and what happens. You know, okay, you've written your book, then what happens? Like, you know, it gets out into the world, then you need to start to share it out into the world, talk, like, how has that changed maybe the work that you're doing, or is the work you're doing getting amplified by having the book? Like, how have you found things have changed because of being a published author now?
I think it's I was so focused on getting the book written and on the book launch that I had not really thought enough about what happens after and all the work that I had to do to get the word out there that I'd written it and that this book existed. So I think I really enjoy doing talks and going and meeting people, but I hadn't really thought about the fact that I should have been doing all of that before the book came out. So in my head, I had to think, right, when the book comes out, you know, in the September, then I will go out and get in touch with all of these people. But really, I should have been doing that beforehand. So that's a learning for book number 2. But it has been great, really. I just went through, I thought, well, what podcast do I listen to? And I asked other people, what podcast do you listen to about sustainable gardening? And just emailing people and them agreeing to interview me. You know, that's been really fun. I've had some really great conversations. I've gone to talk to gardening groups, and sometimes, you know, you go along to these groups and you wonder if they're very traditional, double digging, spraying everything with chemicals kind of groups. But actually, it's been really fantastic that, you know, loads of people come up and talk to me and buy books and say it's really inspired them to change the way that they garden. So I've really enjoyed that.
Yeah, great.
And just to be, it's funny, really. I think it seems odd because I haven't done anything differently in terms of my horticultural practices. I'm still doing the same work that I did before, but suddenly people want to hear about what I have to say because I've written a book, which, you know, is fantastic, because I think there's so many people doing really amazing things that nobody knows about. And that if they could write about it too, they could share that learning so widely.
I think, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's not everyone, but so many people in so many places are doing something particular, like it could be their focus on how to address managing a woodland in a subtropical area, or it could be how to manage a school garden in a highly urbanized area and working with the teachers. Like each one of these different aspects or lenses of how we apply permaculture is so fascinating, and I agree, I think it would be wonderful to have more people that could step. So this is sort of part of why I'm doing this series on permaculture writers within the podcast, because I'd love to encourage people who are listening to think, oh, actually, possibly that's something that I could do, look, she just said she wrote it in the car while the dog was running, it is possible. And, having having people like, Maddie and Tim with the permanent publications, you can pitch to them to an idea and work with them through, actually getting something forward. And they're really open to the idea of people putting forward really practical, positive ideas and have specific knowledge that you can take and do something with. And I think that's really, really wonderful. And,
I think as someone who is not a writer and who has never done writing before, they made the whole process such a joy. It was really such a wonderful process. And I have spoken to quite a few people since, when they've been saying, oh, I just wouldn't know where to start with writing a book. And I explain my process and breaking it down into small chunks so it seems less daunting, because I can't imagine just sitting down with just a blank screen and just starting on, right, this is me starting the book. I don't think I would have ever got started, because that's way too daunting. But I think if you just brainstorming chapter titles and breaking those chapter titles into smaller titles, and suddenly you realize that you've got the framework of a book and you just have to fill in the gaps. And I think that makes it so much more accessible for people who don't have a background in writing to get started, really.
Did you have a writing mentor as you were going through, someone you could bounce ideas around with and see if you're on track, or you just kept going and felt like you
I wrote a couple of chapters, and then after I'd written a couple of chapters, I was feeling a bit nervous about whether I was on the right track. So I sent them off to Maddie to have a read through, and her editor as well. And so they gave some really great feedback, which was, really fantastic, because I think sometimes you forget who your audience is as well, and you can lose focus a bit, and you're sort of trying to sound knowledgeable and using all the right terminology, but at the same time, if you're trying to write for beginners, then that doesn't always really fit very well. So they gave me some great advice on keeping on track with who I was writing the book for. And then I had a great friend, Chris, and I would give her because as I said, my spelling and my grammar is really terrible, so I would give her my draft chapter, and then she would go through and just say, I think you need to explain this a bit more, it doesn't make sense, or move this sentence around, or there was one chapter where she said, oh, I think you need to make this into 2 chapters, you're trying to fit too much into one, I think you need to split it. So I had some great people to help me along the way. And
that's so helpful, isn't it? To have someone have someone like that can just kind of sit down really calmly and just give you that really clear feedback. How did you find your voice, your writing voice? Because it's a particular way, isn't it? That did you try a few different ways of writing first and then kind of land at just, oh, this feels more natural? Or did it you just started and
I think I just started. I just wrote what was in my head, really. I think it just kind of came out. I think there was occasionally I would read bits back that I would think, oh, that sounds really boring. And usually it was because I'd got so bogged down in explaining a technique or something that I was trying to sound really prescriptive, and this is how you do it, and this is how many centimeters apart this has to be. And so sometimes I would read it back and think, I think I need to rewrite that bit to be actually as if I was chatting with someone and just saying, oh, actually, I do it like this and you can do it like that. Or
nice. I think that's
but mostly, it was just what was in my head.
But I think what you just said then is a really lovely thing. It's like, it's your voice as you're chatting to someone. Imagine you're taking someone on a tour through your garden and explaining that. I mean, you were saying about how you were taking people in the garden and they were interested in that. So is that kind of the way that you're explaining, as though imagine you were in the garden with people and sharing out the knowledge of, like, as you would explain it in a class type of thing?
Yes, yeah, I think that's very much how I wanted it to be, not a book saying you must do this or you must do that, or forest gardens must have 7 layers. I think very early on I said, well, we can't have big trees in a forest garden, so we'll just have 6 layers and that's fine. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you might just not want any shrubs in there, that's fine. I just think sometimes books can be off-putting to people because there's so many rules and there's so many correct ways to do things, and if you're not wanting to do it that way, or the book is so prescriptive that you feel you're never going to be able to live up to that, I think it just puts people off. And I think my approach has always been, well, this is what I do, and if you want to do that too, then this is how to do it. But equally you might want to do it in your own way.
That's so great. And I think too, just having all the different examples so that you could show, like, well, this is our approach and this is what we've been doing, this is what's working well, and you can see here, and like giving people options to adapt and localize. I mean, I think that's really encouraging and really offering people a great place to begin to, because it is a bit of a paradigm shift, isn't it, from a traditional way of gardening to a forest gardening approach. And by weaving in all the things that you're saying, like, the beauty and, the people care aspect of it, as also being, part of the rewilding movement too. I mean, all of those different things all coming together. I can, there's so many different reasons why you'd want to do that. So it sounds fantastic. Are you running workshops and courses? Do you sort of weave in your sort of education? Do you have an education hat that you offer courses? I know you said you're doing talks around different places, but do you invite people into gardens and teach forest gardening courses?
We were doing quite a bit of teaching at our previous place, and we did run a few forest garden courses, and we've recently moved, and currently our garden is just flat with nothing in it, so I'm not going to be running any tours or courses here for a while. But at some of the other gardens that I work in, I do manage the garden for Ecology Building Society, which is nearby, and so we're just about to start doing some tours there. So that has elements of forest garden and is also a permaculture garden. And then there's a garden that I manage near Bradford, and that's quite a new community garden as part of a Yorkshire water project. And so I'm going to be running Introduction to Forest Gardens there. So it's quite a young forest garden. We just planted it up this winter, so we're going to be having some tours there.
I heard you just say there's a forest garden and a permaculture garden. In my mind, they're kind of like the same thing. How would you describe what's in your mind? How is the difference in that?
Well, there's areas where the focus isn't food. So there's areas that are sort of borders for pollinators. There's areas which are mainly for habitat. So particularly because it's the Ecology Building Society, there's a lot of focus on sort of looking at the ecology and soil health and habitat and things like that. So there are parts within it where it's a layered food system, and then there are other parts where it's a gravel garden with plants that will grow well in gravel. And so I wouldn't say it's all forest garden, but it's a permaculture garden which has bits of forest garden within it, but so many other interesting habitats and different ecosystems within it as well.
Oh, it sounds amazing. If anyone's listening and they're in West Yorkshire, it sounds like a place to go and have a look. So where can people find you, find your Instagram? I think you have a YouTube channel as well. Do you want to tell us what that's all?
So I started the Instagram partly just for promoting my book, but actually I found that I really love going on there. It's fantastic I love sharing what I do, and and just, I mean, I take loads of photographs anyway, so in that respect it's not really changed. It just happens that I'm sharing them instead of them sitting on my
do you use your phone, or do you have a proper camera when you're doing?
I use my phone. Use my phone, but I bought one that specifically was really good for taking pictures, so that it takes, it's not fantastic for things like close up, but other than that it does, time-lapse video and all sorts of other things that work really well for what I need. So so I'm on Instagram, and I think it's Pippa Chapman _ those plant people. So that's the name of our business as well. And we have a YouTube channel, and that we did quite a bit a few years ago, and then it's been a very long process moving house, and that kind of took our focus away from making videos a bit. And also our internet connection at our previous house was absolutely terrible, and it got to the point where we actually couldn't upload videos. It wouldn't happen. It would. So we're actually really excited that now we've moved house, we've got really amazing broadband, and we can upload things in minutes. So we have just been doing some filming recently. I'm also going to start doing a few videos from the Ecology Building Society garden, and also from the Eschalt Hall garden.
Oh, wonderful.
And so so hopefully, I mean, there are some videos on there that have that are still very relevant around things like ramial wood chip and perennial kales, things like that. But we're just about to start a series of videos all about, particularly here, about going from a completely flat rectangle of ground, and sort of right from the start, the whole design process and building the forest garden.
Yeah, that's such a great thing to show, because if other people are starting, where do you start? If you start on a garden that's already well established, yes, but what happened in all the bits before? So that's so wonderful. That's great. So we'll put in all the links below to where people can get your book, links to your website, links to your Instagram, and links to your YouTube. So if you're interested in following through and seeing what Pippa's been doing, go down below, everyone who's listening, and you'll see all of that information there. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute delight hearing about your work, your writing process, your love of forest gardening, and actually just exploring a bit about the what that means in your context. And I can just imagine walking through those beautiful spaces with all the colour and texture, and just wonderful. So thank you so much, Pippa, and good luck with your writing your second book. That's so exciting. Already.
Thanks,
My gosh, not even taking a break, you're just going, I love this, I'm going to keep on going.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure chatting.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World with the permaculture writer Pippa Chapman. Check out the show notes below to find out more about Pippa's book and links to her work, and also where you can find details of our masterclasses, courses and videos here at the Permaculture Education Institute. Come and join us to learn the practical skills that you need to design your own food forest, and how to teach permaculture and live a one planet way of life. We'd love if you leave us a lovely 5-star review. It does absolutely help the bots find our little podcast, and for these ideas explored in this conversation to myceliate further. Until next time, stay safe. See you later.